Welcome to the BioStock studio in Lund, Medicon Village. Today's guest is going to join us on a link from Boston, Massachusetts in the US. We are going to talk to Mr. Rami Levin, who is CEO of Danish biotech company Saniona. Thank you for joining us virtually today, Mr. Levin. It's a great pleasure having you. And like millions of others around the world, you are actually working from home due to the corona pandemic. And in your case, home is in Boston, Massachusetts. Let me start by asking you, how has the COVID-19 situation affected you personally and on a professional level? I mean, apart from just having to work from home.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure being here. So COVID-19 obviously is an international pandemic affecting everyone, and it didn't pass on me either. And I actually was affected personally by COVID, and was in quarantine for nearly a month. I was in the hospital for nearly a week. But from a company perspective, thank God I was the only one. From a clinical trial perspective, we were able to actually complete our trial in phase 2 in hypothalamic obesity. Um, and despite COVID-19, the last patient actually was captured into the trial and we were able to close the trial. From an internal perspective in the company, we obviously went on kind of an emergency workforce where two people were in the office, in the labs at all times. Everyone else worked from home. I'm happy to say that now, as of today, people are basically starting to come back to the office in Copenhagen. Here in the US, we have 2 employees now, and we're still working from home, at least for now.
And Boston, you're based in Boston, and even as CEO of Saniona, a Danish company, as you said, based in Copenhagen, you will still be based in Boston. So let me start out by asking, how does an American end up becoming a CEO of a Danish company? And what specifically was it that attracted you to Saniona?
Well, first I'll say from my background, I actually was tied to Scandinavia for the past several roles. I was the managing director of Merck in Scandinavia for 4 years. I then was the president of Sobi in North America, and even though I was in North America, Sobi is a Swedish, it's an international company, but headquarters are based in Sweden. So that's another 6 years. So I have over a decade experience in Scandinavia in particular. But I think what is relevant for Saniona is Saniona really is in a transformation right now, and it started towards the end of last year, transitioning from a pure research-based company to a much more clinical development company, starting to think of what clinical trials we would need to do to bring Tesamet, which is our leading treatment for Prader-Willi and for hypothalamic obesity, what clinical trials we would need to do to bring it into the market. And US being the main market we're targeting initially, the thinking was we probably need to bring on board a US-based CEO who has experience in rare diseases, who knows how to bring products to the market, and obviously is based in the US, because if this is the main market we're targeting initially, then you want to be close to the market, whether it's from a clinical trial perspective, whether it's from a financing perspective. US is the largest rare disease market in the world, and having a CEO based here in the US makes perfect sense. And that's where I was brought in.
Uh, like you say, you have a very solid experience in the life science sector, both from a regulatory and from a market and from a commercial perspective as well, including then developing some orphan drugs in the United States. So your past experiences then from Sobi, for example, and with the drugs Gamifant and Synagis, What would you think would be your main contributions using these experiences in Saniona?
Well, bringing a product to market is very complex, and there are many, many different facets and activities that need to be done across the board, from clinical development to market access to commercial. And having done that before, clearly all that will lend itself to help with what we need to do here in Saniona. So we just completed a phase 2 study in hypothalamic obesity. We're going into a phase 2b/3 in PWS with the intent to continue the development in late stage development in hypothalamic obesity as well. So this is exactly when we need to start thinking of what type of trials we need to do to bring the product to market. Um, Before we get to market, we need to start thinking, how do we plan to launch it? So that's where all the commercial experience and background comes in. Market access, distribution, supply chain. There are many, many different aspects that we will have to think through as we get closer to bringing Testament to the patients who desperately need that. And all those experiences are things that I have done before and have done them here in the U.S. So all that will clearly lend itself for what we need to do here at Saniona, including building teams. I built the SOBI team in the U.S., and we will need to build the Saniona team moving forward. We've already announced just a couple of weeks ago, just a week ago, in fact, that we hired the new CMO, the new Chief Medical Officer for Saniona, who started actually on Friday was his first day. That's a critical role for the company because he will be responsible for driving all the clinical development moving forward. But there are many other roles that we will need to hire, including a CFO, which we've already said that we are searching for. At the end of the day, the goal will be to build a full-fledged organization here in the US with all the typical functions that you would expect to see in a full-fledged organization, including, legal counsel, HR, communications, investor relations, et cetera, et cetera.
And speaking of the HO trial, or the hypothalamic obesity trial that you recently then presented top-line results from, can you guide us through the most important findings in this study?
Sure. So this was a phase 2 study, and in a phase 2, typically the primary endpoint revolves around safety and tolerability, and that was the case in our study as well. The secondary endpoints are a long list of efficacy endpoints, of which we reported the most important ones, um, um, the top 3 most important efficacy endpoints. So this was a 24-week double-blind placebo-controlled trial. After the 24 weeks, all the patients were offered the opportunity to go on active treatment. 21 patients started the placebo-controlled phase, and after 24 weeks, 18 of those patients opted to continue into the open label phase. The 3 patients that dropped out, 2 are from the placebo group and 1 was from Testament group. So that in itself actually shows quite a good safety and tolerability profile. But when we look at the primary endpoint, which indeed was safety and tolerability, um, Testament was very clearly safe and well tolerated in the study. Um, when you look at the main efficacy endpoints, then the 3 that we reported on, which I can touch on. So one was weight reduction, where we saw a statistical significant reduction in weight loss of 6.1% between the Testament arm and the placebo arm, highly statistically significant. The other efficacy endpoint that we looked at was waist circumference. And there as well, we saw nearly a 5% reduction in the treatment group versus the placebo group. And here again, it was highly statistically significant. Um, and the last parameter, which was basically a biomarker of hemoglobin, was also statistically significant with nearly 15% reduction of the Testament group versus the placebo group. There are many other efficacy parameters that we're still sifting through the very large database. All the study results, including safety and all the efficacy endpoints, will all be presented in or published in a peer-reviewed journal as soon as possible. But the top-line results already are very clear and suggestive that we should move forward with the development of Tesomet in hypothalamic obesity, which is exactly what we intend to do.
And in fact, you are currently planning an end of phase meeting with the FDA to possibly then move straight from this rather small phase 2 study into phase 3 in HO. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I mean, the one of the first things we need to do, apart from going through the entire study results and analyzing all the data, is indeed prepare for a meeting with the FDA. So once we complete the review of all the data, we will ask for such a meeting. I anticipate that meeting probably will take place towards the end of Q3, maybe beginning of Q4. Um, and in terms of can we go straight into a phase 3, that's exactly some of the work that we will need to do over the next few months. The phase 2 study results were very positive, but there's a whole package that will need to be submitted to the FDA. And that is what we need to look at and evaluate and assess whether we have everything that is required to go straight into a phase 3. And then it really is a conversation with the health authorities, with the FDA, to see if they agree with our recommendation and proposal to move forward.
So this is a patient group that has really no great options for therapies out there, and I know that you have ongoing dialogue with patient organizations that representing patients and families that are affected by this severe disease. And have you had any reactions to your positive study results from that kind of organizations?
Yes, absolutely. And you're absolutely right. We are in contact with the patient organizations. There is no approved treatment available for hypothalamic obesity today. The treatments that are being used are not approved, they're off label, and quoting them are not very effective. So I think they are looking for something new. They're looking for new hope, for a new treatment specifically for their disease. They saw the results, they heard the results, and I can tell you they're very excited. They understand there's still a process, but they're very, very excited. I actually just spoke with them just yesterday. They're very excited about the results. It's very encouraging, and again, very encouraging in an indication where there is no treatment available. So this definitely gives them hope, and hope I think was the main word that they kept on using over and over.
That's great. Um, Looking at the totally different perspective, then we all know that capital flow in biotech is sort of exponentially higher in the US than especially in the Nordics, perhaps. IPOs are much bigger, and there's generally a different approach into taking perhaps a broader pipeline faster to markets among companies in the US. For argument's sake, if we were to say that Saniona would have been an American company from the beginning instead of a Danish company, what would the implications have been, you think, for where Saniona is today?
Um, it's a bit hard to speculate. You're right about everything you said. I mean, this is definitely a much more institutional based investment or investors specifically focused on life sciences, meaning that they are willing to take maybe bigger risks than retail investors or generalists. Um, it's a bit hard to predict where we were. I think if we consider where we are, because it doesn't really matter where we would have been if we would, historically done things different. I think the question is, where are we now and how do we move forward? And I think definitely bringing on board U.S. institutional investors as well as European institutional investors. I guess the focus is on institutional investors is key for Saniona moving forward.
And being a rather small Nordic biotech, then Saniona still has a rather broad pipeline. You talked about the phase 2 study results in hypothalamic obesity. You also have phase 2 study in Prader-Willi syndrome, which is also an eating disorder. And but apart from those projects, you also have Tesomet that's going towards the market in Mexico for treating obesity. And you also have a number of other projects, partnered projects and also internal ones. And looking at Saniona then, coming in from an outside perspective as a new CEO, what other assets caught your eye when you were new coming into the company as a new CEO?
Yeah, I think that's a great question because I think we need to clarify where our main focus is. And our main focus is on our proprietary products that we intend to develop um, and commercialize moving forward. Clearly, historically, a lot of the value of Seniona and the revenue that came in was based on strategic partnerships that we have done, and that will continue. But where our real growth will come from is from our proprietary and less so from the partnerships. So I would separate those into two. From a proprietary perspective, the ones that we are focusing obviously on are, Tesomet in Prader-Willi as well as in hypothalamic obesity. But we also have two early stage assets that we are still exploring for a variety of different rare diseases. One is SAN 711, which is ready to go into phase one, and one is SAN 903, which is a bit earlier in the preclinical stages. And once we have the appropriate financing, we intend to advance both of those molecules into phase one, two, and obviously ultimately three and commercialization, because those will fuel the future portfolio products for Seniona. Of course, if you look at the future growth of our proprietary products, and there are other sources that we would be expanding and exploring. For instance, BD external BD opportunities that we may want to internalize. Um, so not just organic growth, not just research and development that we would advance forward, but also external opportunities that we want to bring in. All that would fall under the proprietary focus. And then separately, there's the external strategic partnerships slash out licensing, where as part of our research, if we identify molecules that are maybe more suitable for broader indications, which we do not intend to develop ourselves. In those strategic cases, we will seek to either partner or out-license those molecules to larger companies who will then spend, the efforts in developing and ultimately commercializing, with the intent that we would get milestone payments throughout that development and ultimately royalties once the products are approved. So, if I kind of fast forward, maybe 4 years from now or 5 years from now, I would see potential two revenue streams coming into the company. The revenue stream from our proprietary products, which we developed and ultimately launched, and following commercialization, we will get revenues obviously coming in. That will be one royal revenue stream. The second revenue stream will be these out licensing agreements where we will be getting revenues coming either from milestone payments throughout the development and ultimately royalties from commercialization. So two strong legs to stand on.
Definitely. And if we look at uh, the most recent news from Saniona then regarding the external, the BD partnering leg, so to speak, of the possible revenue, uh, you actually entered a new collaboration or sort of developed an existing collaboration with Boehringer Ingelheim, and that was about end of March that that was communicated. What can you tell us about that deal specifically?
Well, I mean, we currently have, a really good collaboration and partnership with Boehringer Ingelheim. they have now in-licensed two molecules from Saniona, both for the research of schizophrenia, which I think definitely shows their confidence in our research, which is great. Um, as you mentioned, we have other partnerships, like a partnership with Cadent Therapeutics here in the Boston area, where we outlicense two molecules. We outlicense a molecule to them in two indications. And we also have, the partnership, which is probably the more advanced one, with medics in Mexico and Argentina, where we outlicense tesofensin for obesity. They've done a phase 3 trial. They've submitted it for approval by the Mexican health authorities in December, and they're waiting for the approval, which they anticipate will happen in the second half of this year. And once they get the approval and commercialize it, then we will be getting royalties from them in Mexico. And then going into next year, they plan to do the exact same thing in Argentina. So that's the most advanced of our strategic partnership, yield, which will yield. Which will yield revenue in the near term.
With this broad and exciting pipeline, and you have several products now or projects in late clinical stage. Obviously, funding upcoming milestones is always going to be a priority. So, my closing question with that in mind is, what is your vision of where Saniona stands within 12 months from now?
So my vision is that in 12 months, Saniona will be a well-funded company where we can turn our focus away from this constant need to finance these short-term financing deals and have a much longer-term runway where we can refocus on what we need to do to advance the company. And there are three key areas that's what we need to focus on. Um, number one is advancing Tesomet all the way up to registration, both in hypothalamic obesity and in Prader-Willi. Number two, advancing our earlier stage research, SAN 711, SAN 903, into phase one and ultimately phase two and onwards. And number three, building our organization here in the US, as we've already communicated that we intend to do. We've hired the first person, which is the CMO. As I said, we're going to be hiring the CFO, and there's a whole slew of roles that you would expect to see in a full-fledged pharmaceutical company. And all those we'd need to hire. Those are the three focus areas. So if you ask me where we will be in 12 months, we will be in a position that we could actually focus on those three things.
Well, we are definitely looking forward to following you on that journey. And I'd like to say thank you very much for taking the time to join us from Boston today. And wish you all the best with the projects going forward.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me.
Thank you.